International trade is a vital part of U.S. agriculture. In 2008, agricultural exports exceeded $115 billion and accounted for 1 out of every 3 acres planted in the U.S. As the world's population continues to expand, exports will become the primary source of growth for America's agricultural economy. This graph illustrates the tremendous growth of agricultural exports. As you can see, exports have skyrocketed since 2005. It is important to understand the various components of trade in order to support its growth in the future.
The other thing, too, is as you start to look at the combination of social and political and climatic factors and how they're going to affect trade. I've done some work in the last few years in China. So China is an interest to me because of that. And if you think in terms of what's happening in China now, they're generating a tremendous amount of income. A lot of this income is coming directly from us. That also is creating a middle class in China, which they never had. It's creating a movement from the land into the cities. So you've got a lot of young people that are going to be well educated and are going to have expectations. And expectations that are really going to drive what China does. And I think right now we're seeing more milk prices increasing because China's moved into the market to buy fluid milk, which they never were in that market before, but they now have people who can afford it. Mm-hmm. So there's going to be some changes in markets that we have in the next 30 years.
Compared to other sectors in the U.S. economy, agriculture is twice as reliant on foreign trade.
When I look into the future, the thing that confuses me is that I don't know which factor is going to be the most important one. They probably are all going to interact, and one's going to work against the other in many cases. I think even in America, we're looking at a change in our food culture. I think you're going to see a little bit of change in where some of our food comes from, which is going to change our marketing strategy to a degree as well. And I don't know how far that's going to go. Whether we have more grain this year and can sell it on the world market than we had last year, or whether there's someone out there that can afford to buy it. We really have to start thinking about the long-term viability of our own system to produce a surplus. Because a surplus is what you have to have before you can enter into the marketplace. And then we've got to pay attention to the world climate and also the economic well-being of much of the developing world who purchases what we produce. If they can't afford to purchase it, then we don't have a market to sell it.
Many developing countries benefit from increases in international trade. For example, in Uganda, poverty fell by 40% during the 1990s as it expanded its international trade activity. As poverty fell, enrollment in schools doubled, thus increasing its economic potential for future generations. Unfortunately, some developing countries encounter roadblocks as they attempt to enter the global marketplace.
Some countries that are getting there, some countries have started, the difficulty with many countries in Africa is it seems they take a step forward and a step back, political conflicts and so forth that go on. And Zimbabwe was a country, we had a lot of optimism in the 80s and early 90s. And we're doing better, really. They were definitely doing better then and took a step back and started in the mid-90s and still today. So due to political issues. So that's one of the things that's holding back African countries, very complex societies because a lot of ethnic groups that within any individual country, and so there's a lot of room for conflict. The public about the benefits of trade, because it does sometimes, it's easy to be very black and white about it and say, well, trade is bad or trade is good, but in fact it's some things about trade is good and some things about trade is not so good. And we really, because overall it's been fairly well documented that improvements in trade have helped economies grow. And as economies grow, people have higher incomes and less poverty. But it's also not automatic in a certain.
The U.S. has the ability to meet growing international demand for agricultural products. Through an increasing number of free trade agreements, the U.S. is able to compete successfully in international markets.
We have to continually look at, and our sector will continue to adjust as we compete. The good news is we can compete in.
Each year, the productivity of U.S. agriculture increases by 1.6%, whereas domestic demand only grows by 1%. Accessing expanding global markets is imperative in order to increase the profitability of American producers. As international interests expand, the U.S. must strive to support agricultural trade through policies and agreements which will facilitate success in world markets.